Three inseparable sisters, one beloved daughter, and a bond you'd think could endure anything.
They were one of the long-time families in the neighborhood. Very steady, hardworking, very reliable.
Life is beautiful until it all goes up in flames.
There was no doubt in our minds that the intent was to kill people in the house and to burn the house to the ground.
But of course, someone is hiding a smoldering secret.
The body was wrapped in plastic and cut into 3 pieces.
She fooled everyone, from her family to her friends to the neighbors and even the White House.
Oakland, California isn't exactly Mayberry, but it has a charm all its own.
Oakland is a city which has long lived in the shadow of San Francisco, and it's really unfair that it does because it is a completely different place.
Not a lot of people realize there's a lot of great people living in the city.
Got a lot of ethnic diversity. Oakland has a lot of people who were born and raised in the neighborhood that you'll find them in into their adulthood.
Amongst the most deeply rooted residents here are the Allman Sisters. For the 2 younger ladies, the day starts at Oakland's Maxwell Park, where all the ingredients in this melting pot community tend to mingle.
Maxwell Park was a predominantly African-American neighborhood, and the Almonds were one of the few white families in the neighborhood, and they had been in that neighborhood since the 50s or 60s.
Stevie and Sarah are close as can be. Not only do they exercise side by side, they live together too. Stevie is a hard-working career woman.
Stevie never married, never had any kids. She was pretty much responsible, stayed settled.
She's the industrious one, the one who works hard and provides for the family.
Younger sister Sarah is the one who plays homemaker, though she doesn't exactly have the best track record.
Sarah was kind of the wild card. She bounced around from house to house, had a couple kids, had some ups and downs in her life.
Flaky, yes. But she's always been protective of her big sister. Eldest sister, Leota, is visiting from a little town 2 hours away. And as always, Stevie and Sarah relish her presence.
Leota, she's very soft-spoken, very sweet-natured.
Leota kind of looked over the other 2 sisters. It's kind of like a mother hen would.
But not even Leota's watchful eye can protect the family from the threat looming just around the corner. Later that afternoon, there's a party for middle sister Stevie at her and Sarah's house.
Ain't no party like an Oakland party!
Any excuse for a neighborhood get-together.
On the weekend, we have like a block party or something like that, or something that's going on in the neighborhood. They was pretty nice people. They was pretty mellow people.
And today, they're all gathered to wish Stevie well. After decades behind a desk, she's taking an early retirement. Of course, no celebration is complete without Sarah's daughter, Muriel. A beautiful young woman who's blossomed in the family nest.
Muriel grows up in this house, and eventually she meets a guy, and they get married, but they don't move that far. She moves away, but away is really just down the street.
Despite their different personalities, all three sisters played a role in taking care of Muriel.
Young Muriel has a special place in her heart for her industrious Aunt Stevie.
You could tell that Muriel was a hardworking woman, and she was much more like Stevie.
Indeed, it would seem the family's hard charger has landed in high cotton.
Stevie worked as a bookkeeper for a very small company.
A small company that was sold for a lot of money.
Stevie was given a golden parachute. And so she made out fairly well financially.
Stevie's success is enviable, and she's sharp enough to know that others want a slice of the pie, but not so fast.
She also was very frugal. I mean, she was not anyone who would go out and spend lavishly.
Younger sister Sarah is already Stevie's charity of choice.
Sarah was always struggling. I think that the general understanding with the family was that Stevie took Sarah in to help her, and Stevie was going to allow Sarah to stay as long as she wanted to or needed to.
It's a sweet situation. Sarah gets a roof over her head, and Stevie gets a sisterly companion. But as the Almonds will soon find out, it's not easy to have your cake and eat it too. It's the end of a perfect day. Almost. Lately, this small Oakland enclave has developed a seedy underbelly. These strangers aren't here for neighborhood barbecues. All they want to cook is crack.
A lot of the youngsters in the neighborhood saw that it was easier to sell drugs than it was to get a job at the local burger places.
So what used to be a sleepy community, a sleepy neighborhood, turned into nights where you could hear gunshots, you could hear drug dealers, you could hear loud stereos. It was just a very unsettling scene that they saw play out.
Most residents respond to the threat by heading inside and locking their doors. But a battle for the block is soon to begin. Flush with cash and free time, Stevie dedicates herself to saving the neighborhood.
Stevie and Sarah put a video camera in the front window of their house facing the street to capture the drug sales that were going on across the street.
Stevie wanted the drug dealers off of the corners. She wanted to show the police that, look, this is a problem, and we want you guys to do something about it.
While most of the neighborhood applauds the family's efforts, some friends warn Stevie to steer clear of trouble.
She was crazy for doing it because if you mess around with drug dealers, they'll kill you. They don't care who you are. They will come and they will assassinate you. They will take you out.
Stevie has lit the fuse. It's only a matter of time before the explosion. But her one-woman crusade against drugs is nothing compared to the war that's about to be waged at home. A night out begins innocently enough, with all three sisters and Sarah's daughter Muriel enjoying a meal under the stars. But when the check comes, the lighthearted mood goes up in smoke. Seems Stevie's grown weary of being Sister Sarah's golden goose.
Sarah had no source of income, so everything that she did was supported by Stevie.
Stevie let her know that, you know, at some point you're gonna have to go get a job because I don't plan on taking care of you.
Sarah insists she already has a job as Stevie's live-in maid. That's it. Stevie unloads with an allegation that's been eating at her for weeks.
That maybe Sarah should get a job. Stevie, I'm broke, and is that why you steal my money, Sarah?
Stevie was the meticulous bookkeeper. When she looked closely at the books, she realized that her own sister was stealing from her.
Your mother forged 2 of my checks. 2 of my checks made out cash.
Muriel may have conflicting emotions.
Muriel knew that Stevie was really the breadwinner of the house, and she could rely on Stevie.
I'm gonna pay the check.
But Leota finds fault with both of her sisters.
I think Leota was tired of the situation by allowing that kind of activity and behavior to continue, but she may have seen Stevie as enabling Sarah.
Leota suggested a truce between the two sisters.
Ceasefire or not, the damage has been done. The emotional toll will soon be matched by a physical one, leading all the way to murder.
The manner in which this was carried out was so grisly, but the motive was what was so sinister.
Coming up, a fire-bombed home, a badly burned victim, and a chilling secret. The Allman sisters seem to be living an enviable life in Oakland's Maxwell Park community. Until one night, terror strikes. There's a 911 call from the Allman house. Their home has just been firebombed.
It was a small fire on the side of her house. Sarah was saying that the drug dealer was bothering Stevie, and they had set a cocktail bomb to her house, which started the fire.
The fire department got there pretty quickly after the fire, but there was enough time for the fire to cause a lot of smoke damage.
Maybe that's what you get for trying to be the neighborhood do-gooder. The message seems clear enough. Move out or die.
So the gravity of the situation sank in, and the two discussed selling the house.
All this confrontation with the drug dealers created some tension at home. And it became evident, at least in the house, that Stevie and Sarah weren't on the same page, and that Sarah, in some ways, may have even felt a little bit endangered by Stevie's activity.
And Stevie's not exactly feeling the love for Sarah either. After finding out her younger sister had been stealing from her. But before Stevie can do anything about it, terror strikes the Allman house yet again. Another firebomb. This time, the home is destroyed, and the Maxwell Park neighborhood is shattered. At the local hospital, a terrified woman is admitted to the burn unit. And it's none other than Stevie Allman. Her injuries are serious, but not life-threatening.
Stevie suffered from burns of the face, arms, and torso. They were described as 7%, meaning 7% of her body surface, basically first-degree burns.
Stevie's niece, Muriel, is one of the few allowed to visit. She's stunned by what she sees and hears.
Stevie says that drug dealers set fire to her home, and she says that it's in retaliation to her participation in her neighborhood watch.
Police arrived to take a statement. And what a tale Stevie has to tell.
Stevie Almonds described a Molotov cocktail type item being thrown into the window of the bedroom.
The whole house went up in flames, and during that fire, Stevie suffered burns as she had to run through the fire to get out of the residence.
Stevie never laid eyes on her attacker. And fortunately, her sister Sarah wasn't home. When the fire broke out, she was 3 hours away, in the mountains outside Reno, Nevada.
Stevie said she had just bought a retirement home, that Sarah was there feathering the nest.
This retirement home is out of cell phone range, so investigators reach out to Nevada police to track Sarah down. With Stevie on lockdown in the hospital, arson investigators arrive at what remains of the Allman house.
The job of an arson investigator is to determine how the fire started, how it started, why it started, and who started it. The first thing we look for is what burned. In an arson case, you need to rule out accidental causes. Rule out electrical, rule out candles, smoking, lightning, any type of accidental causes. Once you can rule those out and say for certainty that these did not start the fire, then the fire becomes suspicious, and then you can look at the other indicators and look for other clues. Accelerants, flammable liquids, etc.
But it's not just what is burned that can give arson investigators clues about the case.
What we're looking for is what is not burned. I want to investigate the building. I want to investigate that fire scene. I want to see what didn't burn. I want to walk around the outside of the building and see where my fire patterns are coming from, if they've rolled outside the window, if they've burned outside onto the eaves, burned onto the roof. Well, I need to walk around the structure and look at what's not burned and then narrow myself into what did burn. So in this case, what I would do is I'd start at the front door, make my entry into the building, and I'd look at how much fire damage there was upon the entry. I use my tools, a knife, screwdriver, and I can actually put it into the wood to determine the depth of char. Just tells me a relative degree of how deep it burned.
Whatever happened here, this was no accident.
There was not much left of the house after the fire was put out. It's pretty clear an accelerant was used.
They gutted the bedroom that was in the front, which is the same room where the video camera was.
Whoever set the fire clearly meant business.
They were trying to kill the people in the house. There was no if, and, or buts about it.
Poor Stevie is lucky to be alive. But someone else might not be as fortunate. Investigators are soon to discover a ghastly secret hiding in the rubble.
They saw that there was a freezer there that had been duct taped shut. They cut open the duct tape, opened the freezer.
Coming up, what detectives find will turn this arson investigation into something much more sinister. Arson investigators in Oakland, California, are searching the rubble of Stevie Almond's burned-out home to find out how that fire got started and spread so fast.
We look at the char patterns, the smoke patterns, and what we call the V patterns. The V patterns are an indicator of how a fire burns.
the V tells you that the accelerant came from this direction and took off in that direction. And in this particular case, accelerants were used. One was used in front of the back door and one was used in front of the front door, which is why Stevie got caught in the fire.
Local news brands the blaze the ultimate payback against a neighborhood crusader.
Usually you have drug dealers, gangbangers killing each other. And you might have some occasional idle threat that's lodged against a resident. But firebombing a house, this is all but unheard of.
From her hospital bed, Stevie adds more fuel to the media fire.
Stevie released a statement from the hospital blasting the drug dealers who did this to her home.
The tone of the statements came across as very defiant and courageous.
This story went viral. It just electrified everyone that heard about it.
And before long, her reputation is known far and wide.
She's almost like becoming a Robin Hood in the hospital.
Even the White House had heard about it and wanted to thank her for the work that she was doing on behalf of fighting drugs and for the people of Oakland.
All that publicity means added pressure for Oakland police.
I start talking to everybody that I know who might be into the drug life, talk to them in the jails, talk to them on the street, make contact with them at homes, in the cars.
We hear nothing. We don't hear anybody bragging about this thing. We don't hear anything about any particular individuals that frequent that area that might have been involved in it. The informant network is silent.
To experienced detectives, silence is suspect.
No drug dealers even were aware of Stevie's existence, which seemed odd to me. Also, why would somebody firebomb a person that they wanted out of the picture? Why not just put a bullet in her head?
And wouldn't you know, investigators' findings don't jibe with Stevie's story.
I was led to believe that large Molotov-type cocktails were supposedly thrown from the outside in.
If a Molotov is thrown through a bedroom window, you would expect to find that's where the fire first started. Along with that, I would expect to find remnants of the bottle.
No such luck.
We find glass on the outside, not on the inside, which doesn't make sense.
Kind of contradicts her story. So now we have to look into this a little bit deeper as to what really happened.
Police search the Allman home again. This time, they're not looking for evidence of arson, but rather evidence of a cover-up. It doesn't take long to find.
We find a freezer on the floor in what was the kitchen, and it was sealed with tape.
Who could know what horror rests inside?
One of the techs and two other officers walk over and open up the freezer.
It's a foot.
They found a body in the freezer. The body that's been cut up and placed in freezer bags.
This freezer had acted like an oven of sorts because of the fire.
The seals around the door are made of a thin plastic material, and they're going to burn from the heat of the fire. And once they burn, the door is no longer sealed. It's going to allow the heat to enter into the freezer and to burn whatever's inside there, whether it's frozen food, vegetables, or a body.
Even the most experienced crime scene technicians are rattled by this one.
This is a complete game changer. Not only is there a fire, they've got a dead body cut into pieces in a burned freezer in a house that's destroyed.
My suspicions are pretty much confirmed that this was a murder cover-up that was trying to be disguised by an arson.
The neighborhood crusader has some serious explaining to do.
My next call, naturally, was right at the hospital. I need to see Stevie right now.
But Miss Stevie is no longer receiving visitors.
They instructed me at that point that Stevie had been discharged from the hospital.
Turns out that grisly discovery in the freezer is just the first bizarre twist in one of the strangest criminal investigations Oakland has ever seen.
The investigation took a whole 180 turn.
The Oakland Coroner's Office begins to reconstruct a bizarre and brutal crime. They discover the victim's female. And even though she's been mutilated and burned, cause of death remains obvious.
Her skull had been shattered. Her skull literally looked like a broken eggshell.
They determined at the autopsy that the cause of her death was bludgeoning, severe head trauma.
The coroner was also able to determine she was dismembered after death.
One of the things that we looked at were the bone endings. If they're jagged, that means that there was a knife possibly used to cut the body up. And in this particular case, the bone endings were very sharply cut, so we knew that some sort of electric saw was used. We still don't know who this woman is until we can do the DNA investigation of the body. We really don't know who this body is.
Two people who may have answers are nowhere to be found. Eldest Allman sister Leota and youngest Sarah. Detectives focused first on Sarah, who lived in the house. When Stevie was in the hospital, she claimed Sarah was outside of Reno.
Finding this body, investigators knew she was probably lying to them about where Sarah was.
Oldest sister Leota is also MIA. And Stevie Allman, Oakland's urban folk hero, has left the hospital. Her first stop? The bank.
Upon her discharge, we gave her a check that represented many donations that had come to her at the medical center.
Donations that came flooding in as a result of all the media attention, which she, of course, cashed.
I'm starting to feel like I'm the bad guy because I'm no longer looking at her as this hero and crusader. I'm looking at her as possibly a murderer.
With a fat wad of cash, Stevie could be poised to skip town. So many questions remain. Whose body was in the freezer? Where are the remaining Allman sisters? Who set the fire?
The only option that they had was to talk to her family. The first person that they went to was Muriel.
The Oakland Police Department went to question her about what had happened.
Because this environment was, a little bit different, not your typical American mom, dad, kid environment, Muriel grew very close to her aunts, Leota and Stevie.
Muriel speaks honestly about all the women who raised her.
She understood the type of person her mother was. Sarah was unreliable in providing for her daughter, so that fell to Stevie. So Muriel was protective of Stevie.
Police are at a standstill until they finally get a tip that Stevie is holed up in a nearby hotel.
Officers went out and found Stevie and brought her from the hotel to our offices.
Now to turn up the heat.
Stevie's confronted with the fact that there was a body in a freezer. She denied having anything to do with that.
We did ask Stevie where Sarah might be, and all roads pointed towards Reno.
She says, Sarah's with her boyfriend up in Reno, I believe. And the follow-up questions are, well, can we get a hold of her?
Reno is over 3 hours away, but the way Stevie explains it, you'd think Sarah was on another planet.
Didn't have access to a telephone, didn't have access to a cell phone, didn't know where she might be.
While investigators put Stevie on ice, there's a peculiar development at a nearby police department.
One of the officers said, hey, wait a minute, I think we got something here.
One of the missing Allman sisters has resurfaced.
It's a missing persons report filed by Leota.
But it isn't Sarah she's looking for. The one she's declared missing is Stevie. Confusing indeed, because Stevie is safe and sound in the very next room.
So at this point, what you have is a person who's been identified as Stevie Allman, and then on the other hand, you now have this missing persons report, and the person missing is Stevie Allman. So is Stevie missing or not?
Investigators redirect their attention toward the middle sister, paying special attention to her injuries.
I marked it down on a diagram that she had frontal burns on her legs. She had frontal burns on her arms.
Those burns looked consistent with splash burns.
Having the splash burns on the front of her body would help prove that she poured the flammable liquid out onto the floor or to the area. Some of it splashed back.
Detectives believe the Allman house was lit up to disguise a murder, and they suspect the victim is Stevie's youngest sister, Sarah. But who killed her? Is middle sister Stevie solely responsible for slicing and searing Sarah? Or did Muriel help get rid of her loafing mother? Is missing sister Leota an accomplice to the crime? Or is nothing in this strange case quite what it seems? Just then, the eeriest revelation yet. Turns out the dismembered body in the deep freeze is not Sarah.
It was stunning because everything changed on a dime. It's like suddenly finding out there's no Santa Claus.
Up next, one of Oakland's most macabre murderers is finally unmasked in a plot so twisted it will haunt this town for years to come. Oakland investigators have spent the last 2 hours interrogating Stevie Allman. Or so they think. The coroner's office begs to differ.
They confirm that the body is, in fact, that of Stevie Allman. The crime-fighting woman, the woman who stood up to drug dealers, was in fact dead herself, cut up, stuffed in a freezer.
If Stevie is dead, police have been duped by an imposter.
The look in the detective's eyes was, I've been tricked. I've been lied to.
So who have they been talking to? The person doing the lying is about to be unmasked.
This woman, who had made herself to be some folk hero, was in fact Sarah.
We inform her that we know that she is Sarah.
She never admits that she's Sarah. She consistently identifies herself as Stevie Allman.
But her facade is quickly torn down.
They roll her fingerprints, and she comes back as Sarah.
She starts to be quiet, clams up.
Investigators search her belongings. Only then do they realize how easily Sarah was able to con everyone.
She has Stevie's identification in her purse as well as her own.
You look at both of those licenses and you see how difficult it was to determine whether this was Stevie or Sarah, because they looked so much alike.
Some hero.
She fooled everyone, from her family to her friends to the neighbors and even the White House.
Of course, there was at least one person who could tell them apart. When police confront Muriel, she makes a sorrowful admission.
Stevie's in the hospital. She gets a visit from Muriel. But when Muriel gets to the hospital room, she sees her mother. At that point, Sarah tells Muriel that Stevie is in Reno.
The exact opposite of the story she originally told police.
Muriel asks Sarah, why are you telling the hospital and all of the officials that you're Stevie? And she said, because Stevie has medical insurance, so I'm using Stevie's name to get medical treatment.
Police know the scam was about far more than insurance fraud.
So Muriel was put in a terrible position. Here she has to be complicit, knowing that her mom is taking her aunt's identity for insurance purposes. And then Muriel comes to the terrible realization that it goes much deeper than that.
Police next head to eldest sister Leota's hometown to put the final piece of the puzzle in place.
Leota heard about the events that happened, and she learned of the statement that Stevie had given by her bedside.
And Leota immediately recognized, no, Stevie would never use those words. She would never speak out like that.
Leota tells investigators she called the hospital to talk to Stevie. But Sarah answered the phone.
And Sarah tells her that she's using Stevie's name for insurance purposes. But Leota, of course, finds that very odd. And she simply wants to know where Stevie is at that point.
The jig is up for Sarah, but prosecutors have their work cut out for them.
It was strictly a circumstantial evidence case. My job was to show the jury that although she looks like this sweet lady, this is an evil woman who has committed a dastardly act.
So what actually happened on that blood-soaked, fire-scorched night?
Stevie was becoming increasingly alarmed at Sarah's habits and was going to cut her money source off. And when that was found out by Sarah, she obviously decided to kill her sister.
Sarah beats her sister to death, hitting her in the head repeatedly. And then has to hide the body.
Sarah cut her up. Put the pieces of her body in a freezer. Wrap the freezer in duct tape.
Sarah assumed the identity of Stevie.
Set a fire to the house.
She accidentally burns herself, and then she's off to the hospital.
The grisliness of the crime is shocking enough. But Sarah's motive blows everyone away.
Murdering her sister was, in fact, her retirement plan.
Sarah decided to take the identity so she could assume all those benefits, assume that money.
Sarah indicated that if you're not going to take care of me, then I'm going to take care of me with your money.
The jury is quick to decide her fate.
Was found guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances, and the special circumstances was financial gain.
She's sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sister Leota and daughter Muriel had no involvement in the crime. They are left to wonder how smoldering avarice reduced their tight-knit sisterhood to a pile of ash.
It just doesn't get more evil than that.
I think the only thing that one can conclude from this is you've never seen everything. What it may appear to be may not, in fact, be that at all.
These days, the tale of the Allman sisters is still one of the strangest crimes the offbeat city of Oakland has ever seen. A grim reminder that even the closest of bonds can be broken.
The house stood with the kind of dignity that makes silence feel heavier. It rose above the cold New Jersey ground like a promise made by another century, a mansion with dark shutters, long windows, and enough rooms to hide a family's private weather from the world. In autumn, when the leaves are on it turned brittle and brown, the place looked almost theatrical, as if it had been built to hold a story too large for ordinary walls. The air on it carried the smell of damp soil, chimney smoke from neighboring homes, and the first warning of winter. Inside, there were polished surfaces, framed pictures, church music in memory, and the routines of a family that, from the outside, still appeared orderly. But some houses do not creak because they are old. Some creak because they are carrying too much. Before anyone knew what had happened in Westfield, before the nation learned the name John List with that special kind of disbelief reserved for the seemingly respectable, there was only the impression of a family living behind drawn curtains, a father under pressure, a mother trying to hold her shape inside a narrowing life, children growing in the ordinary confusion of adolescence, and an elderly woman fading into the habits of age. There was no storm breaking over the roof that neighbors could point to and say that was the moment it all began. There was only the slow accumulation of things that do not announce themselves clearly at first: financial humiliation, religious severity hardened into private doctrine, resentment wrapped in politeness, fear disguised as discipline, and a mind that had begun arranging other people's lives as though they were pieces on a board meant to answer only to him. It is one of the most unsettling features of certain crimes that they do not arrive wearing the face the public expects. They do not come through the front door with shouting, drunken chaos, or the twitching instability of a man already recognized as dangerous. They arrive in press shirts. They sit in church pews. They balance checkbooks until there is nothing left to balance. They carry themselves with the flattened courtesy of men who believe that control is virtue. And when they finally act, the action seems to leap out of a life that, in hindsight, was full of cracks no one knew how to measure. John List was the kind of man people might forget even while speaking to him. He did not move through the world with flamboyance or charm. He was serious, contained, restrained to the point of chill. His life had the outer structure of duty: husband, father, churchgoer, provider, yet duty in some men becomes a stage on which pride plays the holiest role. Failure is not experienced as pain alone but as contamination, as a stain no confession can clean. For List, money troubles were not simply numbers turning hostile. They became evidence that he was losing command of the image he believed he had been appointed to maintain. Employment faltered, debt deepened, appearances remained. The family continued living in a large home that symbolized a status he could no longer support. Bills accumulated in the shadows of formal rooms. The distance between the life he wanted the world to see and the life he was actually living widened until it must have felt, to him, like standing over a split in the earth. Yet the terror of exposure did not make him seek tenderness, confession, or help. It drove him inward, deeper, into the cold machinery of his own reasoning. He was a man who seemed to prefer order to intimacy, principle to mercy, judgment to vulnerability. Such people often sound calm right up until the moment they destroy everything near them. The family around him lived in the reach of that gathering storm without, perhaps, fully understanding the shape of it. His wife, Helen, occupied a difficult position inside the household, moving through rooms already thick with financial strain and emotional distance. Marriage in such a home can become a long negotiation with silence. Words are chosen carefully, disappointments are swallowed, then stored. Familiarity does not soften tension. It teaches everyone how to step around it. But children were at ages when life stretches ahead in unfinished sketches. They had schools, interests, moods, private embarrassments, small hopes that would have seemed trivial to adults but were, to them, the center of lived experience. One imagines the sounds of that house before its silence became infamous: footsteps on stairs, the muffled closing of bedroom doors, a radio somewhere in the afternoon, pages turning, dishes meeting porcelain, the brief rise of laughter that comes unexpectedly and disappears almost at once in homes where laughter is not fully trusted. John List's mother was there too, another presence folded into the daily architecture of obligation. In many family homes, old age brings softness, a slowing that compels patience from others. In darker households, it becomes one more pressure, one more reflection of decline, one more reminder that life moves toward frailty no matter how severely one arranges the furniture. These are the human details that give such crimes their lasting ache. The victims were not symbols waiting to be entered into a case file. They were people inhabiting their own hours, carrying ordinary concerns through ordinary days while the person closest to the center of the home was silently converting those days into something final. What makes the List case linger in public memory is not only the scale of the betrayal but the discipline with which it unfolded. There is something uniquely chilling about violence that does not erupt but proceeds. A crime of frenzy allows the mind a terrible refuge: rage, madness, loss of control. But when destruction is prepared, timed, imagined in advance, it forces a more disturbing question. What happens inside a person when conscience is not absent but subordinated, when moral language itself becomes a tool for self-authorization, when prayer and murder begin to occupy the same internal chamber without setting the soul on fire with contradiction. In the years that followed, John List would offer religious explanations, speaking in the careful tones of a man who had spent too long defending himself before an invisible tribunal. He suggested that he believed he was preserving his family from worse corruption, from a world he judged spiritually perilous, from a future in which they might drift away from salvation. Even hearing such reasoning secondhand, one can feel its frost. It is not faith. It is ownership disguised as righteousness. It is the voice of someone who cannot bear uncertainty, and so imagines himself entitled to decide not only how others should live but whether they should continue living at all. Yet those later rationalizations, however grotesque, did not appear out of empty air. They were prepared by years of inner habits, rigid thinking, moral absolutism, humiliation transmuted into judgment, and a belief that his role as patriarch gave him a terrifying claim over the destiny of those under his roof. The opening of this story, then, is not simply about a house in New Jersey or a man under financial strain. It is about the fatal meeting point of pride, control, despair, and belief distorted until it loses every trace of compassion. It is about the way certain tragedies begin long before the act itself, in the invisible discipline of thought. The world in 1971 still allowed a man like John List to move through it under the shelter of assumption. Respectability was a kind of armor. A church-going father, a man with formal manners, a household that looked proper from the street, these things could discourage deeper scrutiny. In suburban America, especially in communities that prized composure, ruin was often expected to remain private until it could no longer be hidden. Shame performed much of the work that locks and alarms perform elsewhere. Families learned how to keep appearances alive even as their foundations weakened. The pressure to seem intact could become its own form of violence, slow and suffocating. List lived inside that culture and amplified its harshest tendencies through his own temperament. To fail publicly was, for him, not just embarrassing, it was annihilating. Better, perhaps, in the courtroom he'd built inside his own mind, to erase the witnesses than to endure the collapse of the role. That is what gives the story its dreadful gravity. He did not simply hate, he concluded. He did not simply panic, he organized. He turned his household into the object of a private verdict and moved toward it with the patience of a man balancing a ledger. The result would stain American true crime history not because it was the bloodiest case of its era, but because it was so methodical, so intimate, and so wrapped in the language of order. A family annihilator does more than kill. He rewrites the meaning of home. After such a crime, every domestic object seems altered. A kitchen table is no longer a place for homework and coffee but a witness. A hallway is no longer transitional space but a corridor through dread. Curtains, carpets, framed diplomas, hymnals, school books, all the unremarkable artifacts of shared life become evidence that ordinary domesticity can sit just inches from catastrophe without changing its expression. In the List case, that transformation was especially haunting because the man responsible did not immediately vanish into a blaze of suspicion. He disappeared into the country itself, into the vast American possibility of reinvention, carrying a new name like a well-packed suitcase. For years, he lived beneath the radar of public memory, proof that a person can do something monstrous and still step into grocery stores, neighborhoods, and church communities, and noticed if he understands how to wear normalcy correctly. That long disappearance casts a shadow backward over the beginning of the story. It suggests that concealment was not an improvisation born after the crime but a skill already embedded in his character. The man who could live under another identity had likely been living under one all along. The dutiful father, the grave believer, the disciplined provider, These may not have been lies in the simple sense. They were partial truths arranged so carefully that the deeper truth could survive beneath them without detection. And beneath them was a terrible vacancy where empathy should have stood guard. As this story opens, then, we are not yet in the moment of gunfire or the horror of discovery. We are in the colder place before that, where the future has already been poisoned by a decision known only to one person. The sky over New Jersey would have looked ordinary enough on those days, the roads carrying commuters, children, delivery trucks, Sunday habits, all the machinery of everyday life moving forward without hesitation. Somewhere nearby, dogs barked at nothing, newspapers landed on porches, stores turned signs from closed to open. The List house remained still, its facade preserving the illusion that whatever dramas unfolded inside it were survivable, temporary, private. That is often how evil prefers to begin, not with spectacle but with concealment, not in a ruined place, but in a respectable one. The contrast is what makes the memory hard to shake. A mansion in a quiet town, a father in a suit, children with futures, a family name that, until then, belonged only to itself. And inside that arrangement, a mind narrowing toward an act so absolute it would leave no room for apology, only explanation after the fact. And even those explanations would feel less like remorse than paperwork filed too late. The first chapter of the List case belongs, therefore, to dread in its purest form, not the dread of what the family knew, but the dread of what they did not. Somewhere between routine and catastrophe, between grace said over meals and the silent arithmetic of despair, between the polished image of a proper household and the private collapse of the man at its head, the ending had already taken root. No one outside the home could yet see it. Perhaps even inside the home it looked, at first, like nothing more than another hard season, another spell of tension, another month in which bills had to wait and voices stayed low. But under that surface, something final was being prepared. And because the hand preparing it belonged to the person society had taught everyone to trust most, the shock would echo far beyond Westfield. It would linger for decades not only because of what John List did, but because of what he represented. The terrifying possibility that devastation can grow in a man who appears composed, principled, and ordinary until the day he decides that the lives around him are his to end. Westfield, New Jersey, in the early 1970s, was the sort of place that seemed to exist in deliberate opposition to chaos. Its streets were neat without feeling new, shaded by trees old enough to make every season look ceremonial. In autumn, leaves gathered along curbs in copper and russet drifts, and the light came down through bare branches in thin pale sheets that made even ordinary houses look composed, almost self-conscious, as if the town knew it was being watched and intended to remain dignified under scrutiny. There were church bells, school schedules, commuter routines, grocery lists written in kitchens with polished counters, and neighbors who recognized one another's cars before they could make out a face behind the windshield. The air carried different messages depending on the hour. In the morning, it smelled of damp grass, cold pavement, coffee, and the faint exhaust of cars leaving for the city. In the evening, it settled into chimney smoke and the soft domestic sounds of doors closing, dishes being stacked, televisions glowing behind curtains. It was a town shaped by habit, by the confidence that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough for people to plan around it. That sort of environment can make danger harder to perceive. When a place is orderly, people begin to mistake order for safety. They assume evil will look disruptive before it becomes destructive. They expect warning signs to be loud. But some lies unravel most efficiently in places where silence is valued, where appearance is its own moral code, where men learn early that collapse should be concealed until it can be managed, or if it cannot be managed, denied. Westfield provided the stage for the List family not because it was sinister, but because it was so convincingly normal. That normalcy deepened the horror that would later attach itself to the address. The town did not create the crime, but it offered the perfect backdrop for a man who depended on respectability the way some men depend on oxygen. John List's world was built on structures that looked solid from a distance. Marriage, fatherhood, religion, class position, routine, personal restraint, all that formed the shell of a life that, to an outsider, would have seemed stern perhaps, but stable. Yet some structures are held together not by warmth or mutual trust, but by tension. They remain standing because everyone inside them has learned how much weight a single honest conversation might bring crashing down. In such households, politeness is not evidence of peace. It is often the tool used to postpone it. The List home, grand in scale and old in its bearing, stood less like a refuge than like a monument to an idea of family that John List could not afford to lose. The house itself mattered. It was not merely where the family lived. It was a visible declaration of status, discipline, inheritance, and standing, the kind of property that silently told the town what kind of people belong inside. Large homes exert pressure. Their elegance can become accusatory when the money thins out. Each room asks whether the life supporting it is real. Each polished surface reflects more than faces. It reflects pretense, aspiration, and, in moments of financial ruin, humiliation. It is difficult to overstate what shame can do inside a man who worships order more than truth. A practical person under severe money strain might reduce expenses, confess the situation, sell what cannot be sustained, begin again somewhere smaller and humbler. But humility requires a certain flexibility of self. It asks a person to survive being seen differently. John List does not appear to have possessed that flexibility. To him, the falling away of status was not just uncomfortable, it threatened the entire moral architecture through which he understood his place in the world. He had been raised in an era that tied manhood tightly to provision, seriousness, and external competence. A husband and father was supposed to lead, protect, and supply. To fail in those duties was not simply unfortunate. It could feel, especially to a rigid and deeply prideful mind, like a kind of spiritual rot. He was not a flamboyant man undone by extravagance. He was more dangerous than that, a controlled man undone by inadequacy. The external details of his life made him easy to underestimate. He was not the sort of figure who entered a room and commanded it. He did not blaze with charm or invite intimacy. He seemed instead like one of those men whose emotional life has been folded so flat it becomes almost invisible. He was educated, restrained, and dutiful in the surface sense. He understood institutions and moved within them respectfully. He presented himself through discipline rather than warmth. That often wins trust, especially in communities that value seriousness. A jovial man may be liked, but a grave man is often believed, yet gravity can conceal many things. In John List, it seems to have concealed a habit of inner judgment so severe that he began to view the lives around him not as independent souls with their own fears and hopes, but as extensions of a collapsing order he alone was entitled to assess. He belonged to the species of patriarch for whom love easily curdles into stewardship, and stewardship into control. Such men do not always rage openly. Sometimes they simply grow colder and more absolute until everyone else in the household is living under the climate they create. The List family inhabited that climate day by day. Helen List, his wife, lived at the center of a marriage that appears to have carried strain on multiple levels. By the time the family's finances were deteriorating, the emotional ground beneath the marriage was already uneasy. One can imagine the rhythms of their interactions, the pauses before speaking, the calculations involved in raising practical concerns with a husband who measured the world through judgment and pressure. In many homes, hardship brings people closer, not because it softens the facts but because it forces honesty. In other homes, hardship exposes old fractures and makes intimacy feel dangerous. Money troubles, especially when hidden, seep into every corner of domestic life. They alter how people hear one another. A simple question becomes a challenge. A suggestion sounds like criticism. An expense becomes an accusation. The air inside the home changes long before anyone outside can name why. There may still be family dinners, school drop-offs, church attendance, ordinary conversations about weather or errands, but beneath them runs a subterranean current of dread. The children, too, would have felt it in whatever ways children feel what adults refuse to explain. They were not abstract victims waiting in the wings of a crime. They were young people moving through the unfinished work of becoming themselves. Their days had texture. There were classrooms, passing remarks from friends, sports or hobbies, private disappointments, the deep seriousness with which children and adolescents hold the immediate world. A poor grade can darken an afternoon. A compliment can brighten an entire week. A sibling's teasing can feel like betrayal by noon and be forgotten by supper. Their lives were still full of the small revolutions that mark ordinary youth. This is what family annihilation obliterates most cruelly. It does not only end lives, it cancels futures in their earliest drafts. It erases all the versions of adulthood those children might have grown into, all the unremarked milestones that never become visible because they are so brutally denied. And because the killer is not an outsider but the father, the crime strikes at the deepest assumptions children are taught to inhabit. Home is supposed to be the place where the night is kept out. A parent is supposed to stand between danger and the child, not become danger in its most concentrated form. In the List household there was also the presence of John List's mother, old enough that her life would have been shaped by memory, ritual, and dependence. Elderly parents living within adult children's households can deepen family bonds or strain them to breaking. Age alters the tempo of domestic life. It adds medication, appointments, fatigue, and the quiet grief of watching a once commanding generation bend under time. For some, this awakens tenderness. For others, especially those already saturated with resentment and pressure, it becomes one more symbol of burden and decay. In a rigid household, even need can be judged as failure. Even vulnerability can become an irritation. The presence of an aging mother in the home therefore belongs to the context, not as background decoration, but as part of the tightening atmosphere. Another strand in the web of obligation, John List appears to have experienced less as human connection than as accumulating weight. Religion played a central role in that atmosphere as well, though not in the way faith is meant to console and enlarge the human heart. In the world John List inhabited, religious devotion provided language, discipline, and a framework of meaning. It could have offered confession, humility, surrender, and compassion. But faith, when filtered through fear and pride, can become a mirror that reflects only one's own authority. It can become a vocabulary for judgment rather than grace. The most disturbing element of the List case is not that religion was present, but that it seems to have been weaponized inwardly, transformed into a scaffold on which he could hang his own private verdicts. There is a vast difference between trusting God and appointing oneself the executor of God's imagined preferences. Yet for minds drawn to certainty, that distinction can erode. A man embarrassed by financial failure, frightened of social humiliation, and obsessed with moral order may begin to interpret his personal collapse as a cosmic drama. Once he does that, ordinary human solutions start to look like compromises, and compromise feels to him like sin. This is how fanaticism often enters, not as spectacle, but as a narrowing of options. The sufferer decides that only the most absolute act remains faithful, honorable, or clean. Outside the house, America was in a period of tension and transition. The early 1970s carried cultural anxieties that touched even tidy suburbs, though their effects arrived filtered through newspapers, television screens, church conversations, and dinner table unease. Traditional structures still held great power, but they no longer seemed unquestionable. Generational differences were widening. Ideas about authority, family, duty, and morality were shifting in the broader culture. For a man as rigid as John List, such a landscape may have intensified his fear. If he already believed the world beyond his household to be morally unstable, then his private failures would not have felt merely economic. They would have felt like surrender to disorder. Men like him often imagine themselves as the last barrier against decline, and that self-image can become lethal once reality begins proving them powerless. There is something especially chilling about a personality that responds to helplessness by seeking total power over whatever remains within reach. That is one reason family annihilators are so difficult to understand through ordinary emotional logic. Their crimes are not acts of love in any meaningful sense, no matter how they later phrase them. They are acts of possession. They reveal a mind that cannot tolerate the independence of others, especially when its own self-concept is collapsing. If he cannot be the successful father, the respectable provider, the guiding patriarch, then no one under his authority will continue on into a future that exposes his failure. This is not despair in the humble, broken sense. It is despair infected by ego, sharpened into entitlement. The family home became the physical chamber in which all these tensions condensed. One can imagine the rooms holding layers of contradictory feeling. There may have been holiday decorations packed away in closets, reminders of better seasons or at least better performances of family life. There were likely school items left on chairs, shoes near doorways, laundry folded and unfolded, bills hidden in drawers. Perhaps unopened envelopes whose weight could be felt before the paper was touched. Domestic life leaves traces everywhere. A hairbrush with strands still caught in it, a coat slung over a banister, a textbook open to a page never finished. These small objects make the context almost unbearable because they prove how recently ordinary life was still in motion. Tragedy is always more devastating when it interrupts the unfinished. A perfectly set stage is eerie. A lived-in room is heartbreaking. The List house, with its grandeur and its silence, would later seem almost Gothic in retrospect, but before the crime it was simply inhabited. That fact matters. Evil did not descend onto an empty monument. It grew in a lived space, among routines, in the middle of ongoing conversations and deferred worries. John List's internal world during this period can only be reconstructed indirectly, but the outlines are grimly suggestive. Financial collapse alone does not produce this crime. Countless families endure ruin, shame, job loss, debt, and humiliation without violence. What transforms hardship into annihilation is character. It is the shape of the mind enduring the hardship. In his case, the available portrait suggests a man who combined emotional distance, rigid morality, self-importance, and a severe need for control. Such a mind does not adapt easily. It does not bend, grieve aloud, or allow others to help. Instead, it calculates. It withdraws. It begins to see other people less as companions in suffering than as variables in a problem requiring a decisive solution. This is the true context of the List murders. Not only a town, not only a decade, not only money trouble, not only religion, but the slow hardening of one man's inner life until every ordinary pressure became part of a logic that excluded mercy. By the time the crime approached, the visible world may still have appeared almost unchanged. The town remained neat. The seasons continued their work. Churches filled on Sundays. Children rode to school. Neighbors performed the ceremonies of suburban courtesy. Yet inside one respected home, the meaning of fatherhood had already begun to curdle into something monstrous. That is why the case has endured so powerfully in the American imagination. It was not only a murder case. It was an assault on the mythology of domestic safety, on the belief that evil announces itself clearly and comes from elsewhere. In Westfield, it came from within the family, from within the structure meant to shelter it, and from within the man most empowered to define the household's moral terms. The context, then, is not merely scenery before the act. It is the tightening wire itself, A respectable town, a proud and rigid man, a family enclosed by financial decline, a large house turning from symbol into burden, a faith emptied of tenderness and refilled with judgment, and a silence so complete that when the catastrophe finally came, it would seem to many not only horrifying but impossible. Yet impossibility is often only what people call a truth they failed to see forming. Before a family becomes the subject of headlines, court records, and documentaries, it exists in a far more fragile and meaningful form. It exists in routines so ordinary they rarely seem worth describing at the time, a mother moving from room to room with the small invisible labor that keeps a household from collapsing into disorder. Children carrying books, opinions, anxieties, and private dreams from one day into the next. An older woman moving more slowly than the rest, bound to memory, habit, and the narrowing territory of age. Their lives are not arranged in neat moral lessons while they are being lived. They are textured, inconsistent, filled with unfinished thoughts and ordinary concerns. That is why the victim's side of a case like this must be told carefully. To reduce them to names in a sequence of deaths is to allow the killer's action to become the dominant fact of their existence. But before John List decided to end the lives around him, the people inside that house were still living forward. They were not symbols of his despair. They were separate human beings, each carrying a different version of what the home meant, each vulnerable in a different way to the atmosphere he created. Helen List stood at the emotional center of that world in the complicated, exhausting way many wives and mothers do. Her role would not have been ceremonial. It would have been constant. The keeping of appointments, the remembering of details, the management of moods, the maintenance of appearances, the work of noticing what others overlooked. In a large home under financial strain, every domestic task acquires an added edge. Things must still appear orderly even when the foundations are trembling. Meals still need to be prepared. Clothing still needs to be washed, folded, put away. Children still need to be sent into the world each morning looking cared for, even if the adults in the home are emotionally fraying. A woman in that position often becomes both witness and buffer. She sees the decline more clearly than others do because she lives among its daily evidence. She knows which bills have been delayed, which repairs have not been made, which explanations no longer hold together. She hears the tension in a husband's footsteps before he enters the room. She learns when to speak, when to delay, when to redirect a conversation before it becomes dangerous in the emotional sense, and sometimes in darker cases, dangerous in ways no one is ready to admit. Helen's life viewed from the outside may have looked respectable and stable, but respectability can be one of the loneliest disguises a family wears. It asks a person to keep performing composure, even when composure has become a burden. One can imagine her moving through the mansion's rooms with a growing sense that the house itself had become too large for what was left of the family's true security. Large homes often magnify tension because they require effort to maintain the illusion they represent. Every hallway echoes, every closed door feels intentional. Every room left empty seems to accuse the people still occupying the rest. If she sensed that the family's circumstances were shrinking while the house remained an oversized shell around them, she would also have sensed the danger of naming that truth directly to a man like John List. Men who build their identity on competence often hear practical concern as humiliation. In such marriages, honesty does not always produce relief. Sometimes it produces icy resistance, moralizing lectures, or long silences that settle over the house like weather no one can change. Yet within that pressure, Helen would still have been a mother, and motherhood imposes its own fierce continuity. However strained the marriage, however uncertain the finances, the children's lives continued to call her attention outward. Their schedules, their needs, their arguments, their illnesses, their emotional weather all required response. A mother in crisis rarely gets the luxury of collapsing completely. She must keep moving, keep smoothing, keep improvising normalcy for the sake of those younger lives still forming in her care. It is possible that this role left her both stronger and more isolated. Strength in such settings is often purchased through silence. The children inhabited the same house, but not the same reality. Each would have known the family through a different emotional map. Childhood and adolescence create separate kingdoms within one home. A child may notice tone without understanding motive, may feel fear without naming it, may learn to read the atmosphere by sound alone. The click of a door handle, the tempo of footsteps, the length of a pause before an answer, these become signals. Older children and teenagers, meanwhile, live at the threshold between dependence and selfhood. They are acutely aware of tension, yet they are also consumed by their own emerging identities. School friends, embarrassment, ambition, rebellion, loneliness, the longing to belong somewhere beyond the family, all of it presses forward at once. This is what makes their loss so especially devastating. Their futures were already branching. There were versions of themselves just beginning to take shape, possibilities still so new they had not yet left a public trace. Perhaps there were subjects they liked more than others, teachers they admired or resented, private rituals before school, favorite snacks. Resentments that would have seemed huge that week and trivial a month later. Perhaps one child was quieter, learning to retreat into inward space when tension rose in the house. Perhaps another was more expressive, more visibly affected by conflict, more likely to test the emotional limits of the adults around them. Siblings do not suffer the same household in the same way. Each develops a method for surviving it. One becomes compliant, one becomes watchful, one tries to make peace, one escapes mentally into books, music, sports, plans for the future. Whatever forms those adaptations took, the crucial truth remains the same. Their lives belong to them. Their father's later explanations could never erase the independent reality of their inner worlds. They were not passengers on his spiritual crisis. They were children and young people, still becoming, still learning what safety meant, still trusting to one degree or another that home was where the day eventually came to rest. In a house under strain, even ordinary family rituals can take on added emotional importance. A shared meal may feel less like simple nourishment and more like a test of whether the household still holds together. A drive to school can become one of the few moments when a child feels the world widen beyond the pressure at home. An afternoon spent in a bedroom, with books open and music low and the light changing through the window, can become a form of private refuge. These are not sentimental details. They are the real substance of a victim's life. They remind us that what was destroyed was not abstract innocence, but lived time. It is likely that each member of the List family had developed unspoken habits around John List's temperament. Families organized around a rigid father often become highly skilled at anticipation. They know which topics create tension. They know how to read his mood from the set of his face or the silence after a question. They know when to be scarce, when to be agreeable, when to let him speak without challenge, when to avoid drawing attention to a problem that cannot be solved in the moment. This kind of adaptation is rarely visible to outsiders because it looks, from a distance, like discipline or respect, but from the inside it often feels like caution. The victims in such cases are not only killed by the final act, they are also shaped for years by the emotional gravity of the person who eventually destroys them. Even before physical violence enters the story, the atmosphere of control has already narrowed their lives. John List's mother, living under the same roof, would have occupied yet another dimension of that private world. Old age changes not only the body but the relationship between time and identity. The elderly live increasingly among memory, among losses already absorbed, among routines that steady a day whose horizons have become smaller. To depend on family in that stage of life is both ordinary and vulnerable. Dependence can expose a person to tenderness, But in the wrong household, it can also expose them to impatience, resentment, and quiet devaluation. An aging mother in such a home might have clung to familiar rituals as a way of preserving dignity, certain meals at certain times, certain objects kept in precise places. The repetition of stories already told, the desire for continuity even as the household around her grew unstable. Her presence in the victim's story is especially haunting because the elderly are so often treated in criminal narratives as peripheral, when in truth they are repositories of family history. She would have known John List not as the public monster he became, but as a son once held in her arms, once corrected, once worried over, once watched as he grew into the severe, brittle man he later became. There is a particular tragedy in crimes that move across generations under one roof because they reveal how family can become not a line of care but a corridor of destruction. The victim's perspective in a case like this also includes what was never fully said. Families under strain accumulate unfinished conversations. Helen may have had fears she could not articulate completely even to herself because to articulate them would have made them real. The children may have carried questions about their father's moods, the family's money, the future of the household, without knowing whether those questions were allowed. The grandmother may have sensed decline without possessing the strength or power to alter it. These silent perceptions matter. Human beings often understand more than they can admit, especially when the truth threatens the structure in which they must keep living. A child may know that something is wrong but choose not to examine it directly because home must remain livable. A spouse may see the marriage hardening into something joyless and dangerous in spirit, yet continue managing day by day because children still need breakfast and shoes and help with homework. The victim's story is therefore not a clean narrative leading toward inevitable doom. It is a field of partial awareness, denial, endurance, duty, and hope. Even in troubled homes, people go on hoping in small ways. They hope tomorrow's mood will be better. They hope a practical solution will appear. They hope the children are less affected than they seem. They hope the season will change something, that work will improve, that church will comfort, that routine itself will carry the family across a hard stretch. Hope in such settings is often not grand, it is granular. It lives in the next day rather than the next decade. That is precisely what makes the coming violence so cruel. It interrupts people not at the point of dramatic understanding, but in the middle of their ordinary acts of continuation. To tell the victim's story honestly also means recognizing the emotional labor involved in loving a difficult man. Families do not always stay around rigid or controlling people because they are blind to the problem. Often they stay because family bonds are made of history, duty, religion, dependence, social expectation, financial constraint, and the persistent human impulse to believe that difficult things can still be managed. Helen's life with John List would have included not only strain but likely memories of earlier hopes, earlier versions of him, earlier reasons the marriage was entered in the first place. The children, too, would not have seen him in only one dimension. A frightening or cold father is still a father. He may also have moments of approval, order, routine, even apparent stability that complicate the emotional picture. Victims in family annihilation cases are not standing outside the danger, clearly identifying it as outsiders might. They are inside a web of relationship, trying to live within it. That is why blame must never drift toward them through hindsight. They were not responsible for correctly diagnosing the darkness in the man closest to them. They were busy living. The deepest grief in the List case lies partly in this fact. Those who died were engaged in the ordinary, unheroic, deeply human work of continuing family life under strain. They were enduring, adapting, hoping, waiting, and carrying forward the habits of a household that still, for all its tension, presented itself as a home. Their lives contained meals unfinished, school years incomplete, aging not yet complete, conversations deferred until later, errands still to run, emotional repairs that may or may not ever have happened. None of them woke inside a drama they fully understood. They woke inside their lives. And those lives, though overshadowed by John List's later notoriety, deserve to be remembered in their own right. Helen with the exhausted resilience of a woman holding to many threads at once. The children with their unfinished selves pressing toward adulthood. The elderly mother with the slow dignity and vulnerability of age. The victim's statement, if it can be imagined at all in a story where they were denied their own final words, is not a single declaration. It is the sum of their ordinary existence. It is the sound of movement in the house before silence took over. It is the evidence that they were there as people and not just casualties. It is the reminder that inside the imposing New Jersey home there was not a tableau awaiting tragedy, but a family still caught in the rhythms of daily life, still carrying private thoughts no one else could fully hear, still assuming in one way or another that tomorrow belonged to them. That assumption, so basic and so innocent, is what the killer stole first long before he stole breath. He stole the future from the people who had entrusted their present, however imperfectly, to the same roof under which he had been given the role of protector. And because they were his wife, his children, his mother, their story must never be told as a footnote to his psychology alone. It begins with them alive, separate, vulnerable, and real, moving through the last ordinary stretch of their lives without knowing that the man sharing their name had already begun to think of them not as loved ones, but as lives he believed he had the right to end. The day itself did not arrive with the kind of atmosphere people later wish it had. There was no sky split open by thunder, no unnatural hush over the neighborhood, no visible sign that the house standing in quiet New Jersey dignity had become, by then, the setting for a decision already made in one man's mind. That is part of what makes crimes like this feel so permanently unsettling. The world outside continues in its ordinary rhythm, indifferent and unchanged, while inside a private home the meaning of everything is being rewritten. Morning comes, light moves across floors. Water runs through pipes. Somewhere beyond the property line a car door shuts, a dog barks, a newspaper lands against a porch. The routines of civilization continue as if routine itself were protection. But routine is only a pattern, and patterns do not defend anyone when the danger already lives inside the house and knows exactly how the day is arranged. By the time the murders began, John List was not improvising. He had crossed beyond hesitation into plan, and that difference is crucial. There is a terrible moral abyss between violence that explodes in sudden passion and violence that is prepared, scheduled, and internally justified before the first irreversible act occurs. What happened in the List home belongs to that second category. The incident was not only a series of killings. It was the execution of a private verdict, one that had apparently been forming under the surface of daily life long enough for him to begin treating the future as something already settled. That is why the incident must be understood not as a moment of emotional collapse, but as the outward completion of a colder process. The emotional collapse had happened earlier, silently, in thought. What remained now was action. To imagine the opening of that day is to imagine a house still carrying the traces of family life. Bedrooms containing clothes, books, school materials, personal objects left where they had been used, a kitchen bearing the recent habits of meals and routines. Hallways still holding the echo of those who moved through them every day without suspecting that the household had already, in one mind at least, been condemned. A family home is full of evidence that life assumes its own continuation. That assumption is visible everywhere. There are things left out because someone expects to return to them. There are tasks not yet finished because time seems plentiful enough to finish them later. There are ordinary domestic postponements that only become heartbreaking after the fact. The cruelty of the incident lies partly in that contrast. Those inside the house were still moving through hours that belonged, in their understanding, to the normal obligations of living. John List, meanwhile, had entered a state in which those same hours were no longer shared time but controlled sequence. He seems to have seen the day less as something being lived with his family than as something being managed over them. There is something especially chilling about that transformation. It marks the moment when intimacy has been fully replaced by dominion. A wife is no longer seen as a person with her own mind, dignity, and future, but as someone included within a decision made elsewhere. Children are no longer encountered as vulnerable lives requiring protection, but as dependents whose existence can be terminated under the authority of the father. An elderly mother becomes not a human being bound to him by history and care, but another element in a plan. When that moral inversion is complete, the acts that follow may still appear outwardly calm. Calm is not innocence. In some crimes, calm is the final luxury of the person who has already silenced conscience enough to proceed. The incident in the List case unfolded within that calm, which is one reason it has retained such power in the public imagination. We are disturbed not only by bloodshed, but by composure in the service of bloodshed. One can imagine John List moving through the house with the inward stillness of a man who has mistaken certainty for righteousness. It is possible that he prayed. It is possible that he experienced the day not as murder in the language most people would use, but as a terrible duty interpreted through the warped religious logic he later offered. That does not mitigate the crime, it deepens its horror. To cloak violence in the garments of moral conviction is to attempt to make cruelty sacred, and the more disciplined the killer appears, the more clearly one sees that what has failed is not impulse control but the entire moral framework through which he has granted himself permission to proceed. The wife who shared his home, the children who relied on him, the mother who had once cared for him when he was helpless, all were placed beneath a judgment none of them had participated. None of them had any chance to contest, and none of them likely saw approaching in its full form until it was too late. The day therefore becomes not only a chronology of action but an anatomy of betrayal. Every domestic familiarity inside the house would have worked in his favor. He knew where people would be, how the day moved, how trust functioned within the household. Family life creates predictability, and in healthy homes that predictability is a comfort. In murderous hands, it becomes opportunity. The routines that should have made the family safe made them accessible instead. That is one of the most unbearable truths at the core of family annihilation. The very intimacy that ought to protect becomes the mechanism through which violence is delivered with maximum control. The victims are not taken by surprise because they ignored danger from outside. They are taken by surprise because they are inside the ordinary trust structures of home, and home has suddenly changed its meaning without their knowledge. The incident moved through generations under one roof. That fact alone gives it a particular bleakness. It was not the destruction of a single relationship breaking under strain. It was the collapse of the family line inside the family home, carried out by the person occupying its center of power. Wife, children, mother, the arrangement itself matters. It reveals the scope of the annihilating impulse. John List was not striking at one person he blamed. He was erasing the immediate human circle around him, the domestic universe in which his failure as provider, patriarch, and moral authority had become unbearable to him. That is why the killings cannot be separated from the psychology of possession. He was not escaping his family. He was deciding that if he could not sustain the life they represented, they would not continue without him. This is not the logic of sacrifice. It is the logic of ownership carried to its most monstrous end. The home, during those hours, would have become something almost unrecognizable in spiritual terms even while the furniture remained still, the walls stood upright, and the rooms retained their familiar appearance. There is something uniquely disturbing about indoor crimes of this kind because domestic space is designed for repetition, comfort, and memory. Hallways connect known rooms. Staircases lead to beds, closets, children's belongings, family photographs, the residue of shared years. To commit murder in such a setting is to turn accumulated intimacy into a weapon against itself. Every room becomes divided between what it had been and what it now holds. One cannot think of such an incident without imagining the afterimage of normal life still clinging to the scene, a coat hanging where it had been left, a school item not yet put away, a chair slightly moved from its place, evidence that the day had expected to continue. Even without dwelling on the physical details of the killings themselves, the emotional violence of that interruption is immense. It is the obliteration of continuity. It is the forced end of unfinished days, and at the center of it stood a man acting not as though he had lost control, but as though control had reached its purest form. That is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the incident. In many notorious crimes, the public looks for madness because madness creates distance. If the killer was visibly incoherent, then ordinary families can reassure themselves that the danger would have looked different from everything familiar. But List did not offer that easy separation. He appears instead as a man who had become terrifyingly coherent within his own distorted worldview. He could plan, sequence, conceal, and move forward. He could function. That functionality is the point of terror. It suggests that the human mind can be both organized and morally catastrophic at once, that a person can remain externally composed while internally crossing every line that makes civilization possible. The incident also contains, in its aftermath within the same day, the first gestures of concealment. Murder alone was not enough. The scene had to be managed. Appearances, even then, still mattered. This tells us something profound about the continuity between the life John List had lived before the killings and the actions he took after them. The same obsession with control, presentation, and order that had shaped his public identity did not dissolve once the murders were complete. It continued. The household had to be arranged into silence. The world outside had to be delayed in its understanding. He did not suddenly become a different kind of person after the act. He remained the same kind of person, only fully revealed. Even in the shadow of unspeakable betrayal, he seems to have retained the bureaucratic instincts of a man managing outcomes. That moral coldness is often more haunting than frenzy. It means the humanity of the victims had already been subordinated so completely that even after their deaths, they were still being handled as part of his plan. A family annihilator does not only end lives. He attempts to dictate how the world will encounter those ended lives, when their absence will be noticed, how long his own freedom will last, what story will temporarily replace the truth. The house, during those post-incident hours, must have felt suspended between two incompatible realities. To the outside world, it still belonged to the realm of the living family. To the men inside it, it had already become something else, a completed site, a closed chapter, a domestic structure emptied of its future but still useful for staging delay. This split between appearance and reality had defined the family's life for some time, but after the incident it became absolute. That is one reason the List case endures. It is not just a story about murder. It is a story about the terrifying length of time reality can remain hidden when concealed by the rituals of normalcy. Curtains still hang. Cars may still sit where neighbors expect to see them. Mail still arrives. A respectable address continues existing on the street map. Meanwhile, the truth has already become irreparable. In narrative terms, Part 4 is where the private tensions of the earlier sections stop being atmospheric and become irreversible. But it is important not to flatten that shift into a simple action scene. The incident is tragic precisely because it is the collision point between ordinary life and final violence. It is where breakfasts, school schedules, domestic concerns, old grievances, financial dread, religious distortion, and patriarchal control all narrow into a single day from which no one in the family, except the killer, emerges. The emotional weight lies not only in what he did, but in the fact that he did it within the daily world his victims had trusted enough to inhabit without fear. Every true crime case involving the family contains a second, quieter one, the theft of trust from everyone who comes after. Once people learn such a story, the idea of home changes slightly. The father at the dinner table is no longer automatically reassuring. The respectable house on a quiet street is no longer proof of safety. The language of duty and religion no longer sounds innocent when spoken by a man who cannot tolerate weakness. The incident in the List case has that lasting cultural force because it punctured more than one household. It punctured a national fantasy that order, religion, and domestic structure naturally restrain darkness. In reality, they can conceal it beautifully when the person at the center knows how to wear them. The New Jersey setting matters here not only because it was the physical location, but because it represented a certain American promise: stability, family continuity, upward respectability. The incident violated all of that from within, and in doing so revealed how fragile those promises become when one person is allowed to define morality as obedience to his own fear. What happened in that house was not the sudden arrival of evil in an otherwise transparent life. It was the completion of a long inward process that no one outside had fully seen, and that those inside could not have been expected to diagnose in time. The day's horror belongs, therefore, to both action and blindness, his deliberate movement through the plan, and their final unawareness that the person nearest to them had already stepped beyond the boundaries of human care. By the time the incident ended, the List home had been transformed from a strained family residence into a mausoleum of appearances, and John List had crossed the line that divides private despair from historical infamy. Yet even then one senses that he did not experience himself as infamy. He likely experienced himself as resolve. That is what makes him so chilling. He did not need the world's approval in that moment because he had already built a smaller, harsher court within himself and declared the verdict sufficient. The killings were the enactment of that verdict. The silence that followed was its immediate aftermath. And the emptiness left behind was not only the absence of 5 lives, but the destruction of every ordinary expectation those lives had carried into that day. In that sense, the incident did not merely happen inside the house. It devoured the meaning of the house itself. What had once been a family home became, in a matter of hours, a monument to the most intimate form of betrayal. The moment when a father ceased to see those closest to him as human beings and treated their existence as a problem he alone had the right to solve. By the time a crime scene is finally discovered, the violence itself is over, but another kind of darkness begins. It is the darkness of reconstruction, of rooms that can no longer speak except through the objects left in them, the positions of things. The silence that has settled unnaturally over a place once shaped by daily movement. In the List case, the house did not immediately surrender its secret. That delay is part of what made the discovery so haunting. The murders were not exposed by an instant alarm or a dramatic interruption. Instead, the family home remained standing in its ordinary grandeur while absence slowly thickened around it. The neighborhood continued living beside it. Days passed, mail accumulated, routine outside the property line continued with the same calm confidence as before. Somewhere nearby, cars came and went, lawns were crossed, doors were locked at night, televisions flickered behind curtains, and ordinary people assumed that whatever silence belonged to the List house was still part of the private weather of family life. But silence changes character when it lasts too long. A home can be quiet in 100 harmless ways, yet after enough time, quiet begins to resemble erasure. There is something especially eerie about a house that looks preserved rather than abandoned, because preservation suggests intention. It suggests that someone has taken care to hold appearances in place just long enough for reality to hide behind them. That is what the List home became in the period before discovery, a carefully hushed container of the unspeakable. When people finally entered, and the truth emerged, the first shock would not have been movement or chaos, but stillness. Crime scenes involving sudden public violence often bear the marks of disorder immediately. A family annihilation inside a private home can feel different. The setting remains domestic. Furniture is where it belongs. Pictures still hang straight on the walls. Everyday objects continue radiating the assumption of family life. That contrast is what unsettles the human mind so deeply. The scene does not announce horror through ruin alone. It announces horror through the coexistence of normal surroundings and irrevocable absence. Here is a table at which people once ate. Here is a hallway people once crossed without fear. Here is a staircase leading upward into bedrooms where tomorrow had been expected. And here, within that ordinary architecture, lies the evidence that home has been converted into something its walls were never meant to hold. The discovery in such a setting carries a specific emotional force because those who arrive are not merely seeing the aftermath of death. They are seeing trust broken at the level of structure. The house itself has become a lie. Every object now points backward toward a life that was interrupted without warning. Every room has to be looked at twice, once for what it had been in ordinary time, and again for what it has become in forensic time. That shift from domestic meaning to evidentiary meaning is one of the most tragic dimensions of crime scene discovery. Bedrooms stop being places of sleep and privacy. They become sites of sequence, timing, and interpretation. Family possessions cease to be possessions and become clues. The dead are encountered first not through memory but through arrangement. Even the air inside such a house seems altered, heavy with closure, with the sensation that time itself stopped inside while the rest of the town continued onward. In the List case, the initial clues were inseparable from the strange persistence of normal-looking conditions. The family had not been publicly accounted for. Their disappearance had not produced an immediate, fully understood emergency. Instead, there was delay, and delay always changes the nature of discovery. It allows the killer's intention to linger in the scene. It lets the house become a stage upon which absence matures into suspicion. Neighbors may notice curtains never changing, activity failing to resume, small patterns breaking down. Someone may ask a practical question and receive no answer. At first, these interruptions can be explained away. People travel, families leave town, illness happens, privacy is respected. Suburban life is often built on the assumption that what happens inside a home belongs, until proven otherwise, to the family within it. That assumption protects dignity in ordinary times. In extraordinary times, it protects concealment. When the house was finally entered with real concern, what waited inside was not merely death, but planning made visible. The scene would have communicated almost immediately that this was no accident, no intrusion from a passing predator, no random event of public violence. It carried the unmistakable signature of intimacy. In a family home, the distribution of bodies, the lack of external disorder in certain places, the continuity of the interior arrangement, all of this would have suggested that the killer knew the space and its inhabitants intimately. Crimes of this kind do not need a note to declare themselves personal. The house itself says so. The positions of ordinary belongings, the undisturbed familiarity of the rooms, the absence of the kinds of frantic disruption associated with outside invasion, all point inward, toward someone who belonged there and moved through it with confidence. That is the first and perhaps deepest clue in any family annihilation scene. Not a single object, but the terrible fact that the home has not been breached so much as betrayed. There is also the matter of emotional evidence, which never appears on official diagrams, but always shapes the human experience of discovery. The List home would have carried layers of it. There were the signs of children's lives interrupted, which are often the most unbearable details for anyone walking through a murder scene. A child's belongings do not know that the child is gone. School materials remain where they were placed with the expectation of later use. Clothing still suggests tomorrow's dressing. Personal items radiate the unfinished texture of ordinary youth. This kind of evidence does not help only in constructing chronology. It testifies to innocence. It insists that these were people in motion, not abstractions. The same is true of the adult spaces. A wife's objects, an elderly mother's routine possessions, the ordinary arrangement of domestic labor, all of it remains behind like a language the dead can no longer speak. Investigators in such homes must look clinically at what is, in every human sense, heartbreaking. They must measure while feeling. They must separate sequence from grief, even as grief is built into the walls. The initial clues in the list case would therefore have included not only forensic realities, but the eerie impression of order maintained beyond life. This is what John List left behind, not the chaos of emotional explosion, but the residue of a mind determined to stage delay, to hold the world off a little longer, to let the family home continue impersonating normalcy after normalcy had already been destroyed. That feature sets the case apart in public memory. The crime scene was not only a place where murders occurred, it was also a place where concealment had been woven into the aftermath. In many notorious cases, the scene screams, here, the scene withheld, and that withholding became one of its loudest clues once people understood what they were looking at. The house itself had been turned into an accomplice of time. That reveals much about the killer's psychology. He was not done exerting control when the killings ended. He needed the truth to arrive on his own terms, or at least later than it otherwise would have. He wanted absence to remain unconfirmed long enough for him to move beyond immediate reach. In that sense, the crime scene contained evidence not only of what happened, but of what happened next in his mind. He was already thinking ahead, to delay, to escape, to the management of appearances. The initial clues must therefore be read in two directions at once. They pointed backward toward the acts committed inside the home and forward toward the fugitive logic already taking shape beyond it. One can imagine the emotional impact on the first people to fully comprehend the scene. Even trained responders are still human beings before they are technicians. To walk into a grand residence in a respectable town and realize that an entire family has been extinguished inside it is to feel the floor of ordinary social belief tilt beneath you. The size of the house, the social standing it implied, the domestic order still visible in it, all of that would have deepened the disbelief. There is a difference between encountering violence in a place already associated with danger and encountering it in a space designed to project dignity and family continuity. The latter forces the mind to reconcile incompatible truths. This was a home. This was a slaughter site. These people live here. These people died here. The father belonged here. The father did this. Such realizations do not arrive all at once. They build, each clue narrowing the field of possible explanations until the unthinkable hardens into the only explanation left. The early clues also included something more intangible but no less important, the sense of time having been manipulated. A fresh crime scene and a delayed one tell different stories. Delay creates peculiar textures. It freezes certain moments while allowing others to decay. It introduces an uncanny relationship between recent life and discovered death. The mail piling up, the lack of response, the stale preservation of routine, these become part of the crime's atmosphere. They tell investigators that the family did not simply vanish from public view. They were hidden by the continuity of the home's outward face. This hiddenness made the eventual discovery feel less like uncovering a single act and more like stepping into a sealed chamber where one man's decision had been allowed to sit undisturbed in the dark. That dark matters. It is not only physical, it is moral. It represents the span of time in which the killers will remain unchallenged, the period in which the victims were denied even the dignity of prompt witness. That, too, is part of the cruelty of the crime. The dead waited in silence while the man responsible began the next phase of his life. In forensic terms, a scene like this invites sequence. Who was where, when, and in what order? What path did the killer take? How was the house used after the murders? What signs reveal deliberation rather than impulse? But beneath all that lies the emotional architecture of the place, and in the List case the architecture itself carries symbolic weight. This was not a cramped apartment of desperation, or a roadside site of sudden violence. It was a large, respectable family residence, a structure associated with continuity, aspiration, and establishment. The crime scene therefore spoke to a broader American unease. It suggested that prestige and domestic formality cannot protect a family from internal collapse. More disturbingly, they can disguise that collapse until it is nearly complete. The initial clues scattered through the house would have underscored that point again and again. The polished setting did not soften the horror, it sharpened it. The appearance of refinement became part of the contrast that made the death so memorable. Some crime scenes tell the story of a brutal world intruding on ordinary life. This one told the story of brutality rising from inside ordinary life itself, and then taking pains to make the ordinary facade persist just a little longer. That is why the discovery phase in the List case belongs not only to investigation, but to haunting. Once a family home is uncovered in this state, it changes forever, not just for those connected to the case, but in the public imagination. The address ceases to be an address. It becomes a symbol, a container for dread, a reminder that evil can live for years beneath the manners and routines of middle-class domesticity. The first clues are therefore not merely technical entry points into solving a crime. They are the first fractures in the illusion that such a home was ever safe in the way it appeared. By the time investigators, officials, and later the public began trying to understand what had happened, the house had already told them the essential truth in its own mute language. This was not random. This was not outside. This was intimate, deliberate, patient, and cold. The rooms, the arrangements, the waiting silence, the delayed discovery, the ordinary artifacts of family life interrupted, but not erased. All of these pointed toward a killer who knew the habits of the home because he was one of the habits of the home. And that, finally, is the most devastating clue of all. The crime scene did not simply reveal death. It revealed that the source of death had shared meals there, walked those hallways, inhabited that structure under the title of father and son and husband. The discovery exposed not only a massacre, but a terrible inversion of family itself. What should have been the safest identity in the house had become the most lethal one, and the clues left behind in the stillness of the rooms were not only pieces of evidence. They were the shattered remains of trust, laid out in a mansion that had once been mistaken for a fortress, and was now understood too late as the stage for one of the most chilling betrayals in American criminal history. When investigators begin working a family massacre, suspicion moves first through the house like a second wind. It touches every relationship, every recent argument, every financial problem, every absence that can be converted into motive. In the List case, the first true suspect did not emerge from the outside world at all. He existed as an absence inside the center of the crime. John List was not found among the dead, and that fact changed everything in one sense. It simplified the direction of inquiry immediately. In another, it opened a vast and frustrating field of uncertainty. A missing father in a house where his wife, children, and mother had been killed is not simply a person to locate. He is the shape around which every theory begins to tighten. Yet even when suspicion points inward, the path to certainty is rarely straight. Investigations in such cases do not proceed as clean moral stories. They proceed through paperwork, interviews, conjecture, false emphasis, emotional fatigue, and the slow grinding work of building structure from horror. The dead are silent. The living are partial, frightened, mistaken, or withholding, and the suspect, if he is disciplined enough, can turn time itself into his first and most effective accomplice. In the days after the List home gave up its terrible secret, the investigators would have found themselves confronting two crimes at once. The first was the massacre itself, intimate and devastating. The second was the disappearance, which transformed the father from presumed victim or witness into the gravitational center of the case. A man does not vanish cleanly from a family annihilation without pulling enormous suspicion onto himself, but suspicion is not the same as apprehension. The world beyond the house remained open. Roads extended in every direction. State lines meant little to a man willing to abandon his past. Paper identities in that era could still be assembled with less friction than people today might imagine. A person who understood how to look ordinary could enter the vast anonymity of American life and be received, if not warmly, then at least without resistance. That possibility hung over the investigation from the beginning like a taunt. The killer was not merely unknown in abstract terms. He was likely out there breeding, traveling, adapting, perhaps already thinking ahead to the face he would wear next. But before that possibility hardened into the case's most maddening reality, investigators had to move through the disciplined process of examining everyone and everything around the family. This is where Part 6 truly lives, in the widening circle of suspicion, the inevitable narrowing toward John List, and then the long dead-end created by his ability to disappear into the country's ordinary surfaces. At first, every family relationship becomes investigable. Helen's life, her friendships, her private tensions, her possible conflicts, her habits, all would have been examined. Investigators must ask painful questions not because they disrespect the dead, but because murder rearranges intimacy into potential evidence. Had there been affairs, feuds, threats, humiliations, neighbors who had noticed something, relatives who had recently argued with the family, debts owed, resentments brewing, strangers seen near the property, patterns of tension that in ordinary life might have passed as domestic unhappiness, but in retrospect demanded re-examination. The children's lives, too, would have been combed through, though they were victims. Schools, routines, known acquaintances, any sign that someone outside the family circle had fixated on them or crossed paths with them in a threatening way. John List's mother, living under the same roof, added yet another layer. Investigators had to consider not only the dynamics of the younger family unit but the older generational ties, inheritance questions, dependence, friction, and emotional burden. Every family under pressure generates rumors after tragedy. People remember odd remarks too late. They retrofit significance onto casual observations. Someone recalls a tense exchange, another remembers a closed curtain, a third speaks about the father's seriousness or the family's reserve. These memories matter, but they also mislead. An investigator must sort intuition from evidence, grief from fact, neighborhood mythology from usable information. In a community like Westfield, where decorum and privacy had likely masked much of the family's inner life, that task would have been especially delicate. Respectable families often leave behind very little public emotional record. Their difficulties exist in fragments, in subdued impressions, in remarks made carefully and then withdrawn. So the investigation had to work through a paradox. The crime scene suggested intense intimacy, planning, and familiarity. Yet the social world around the family may have yielded only restrained clues, because the family had lived behind the screen of propriety until the screen tore apart. John List, even before he became the obvious suspect, would have stood out as the great unanswered question. Where was he? Why was he gone? Why had he not reported the crime? Why had he left the family home in this condition? Why had he removed himself from the scene in a way that looked less like panic than departure? These are not the kinds of questions a man can answer passively by remaining absent. His absence answers them on its own. And yet investigators still had to do the work of establishing him not merely as suspicious, but as the central architect of the crime. That meant reconstructing the family finances, his employment troubles, his habits, his mental and religious worldview, his recent movements, any preparations he might have made, any withdrawals, purchases, papers, or arrangements suggesting premeditation. This is the unglamorous center of murder investigation. The public often imagines revelation arriving through one dramatic clue. More often it arrives through accumulation. Numbers do not match. Dates align too neatly. A man's story collapses because there is no story. A household's pressures point toward the one person who had both motive and opportunity, and who is now conspicuously nowhere to be found. Still, even as the case narrowed intellectually, it expanded geographically. That was the real wound at the heart of the List investigation. Once he fled, the house stopped being the whole battlefield. America became the battlefield. Law enforcement could identify and circulate his name, push his image outward, and search through conventional channels, but the country was large, and a disciplined fugitive did not need brilliance to evade capture. He needed only steadiness, caution, and the willingness to live a smaller, false life for as long as necessary. John List appears to have possessed exactly those qualities. He was not a flamboyant man who needed attention. He was not driven by the hunger to boast or taunt. He was the sort of man who could reduce himself to procedure, who could become beige on purpose. That is a formidable trait in a fugitive. The very qualities that made him spiritually chilling as a family annihilator also made him operationally dangerous once he disappeared. He knew how to be inconspicuous. He understood institutions, routines, and the social camouflage offered by respectable behavior. He knew how to speak in ways that discouraged deeper curiosity. In a culture that still trusted surface decency, such a man could pass more easily than anyone wanted to admit. So the investigation entered one of the most psychologically punishing phases any homicide case can endure, the phase in which the likely killer is known in essence, but remains physically unreachable. Investigators likely followed leads that promised motion and collapsed into nothing. Sightings would have emerged from different states, each one carrying the same hopeful tension: a man at a motel, a churchgoer with a familiar face, someone who used the wrong name too carefully, a report from a relative, an employer, a stranger, a clerk. Most leads in fugitive cases die quickly. They are based on resemblance, rumor, fear, or the simple human habit of seeing notorious faces in ordinary crowds once the image has entered public consciousness. Yet each lead must be weighed because the one that seems thin may be the one that matters. This produces a particular investigative exhaustion. Every possibility feels both urgent and disposable. Resources are spent, attention shifts, promising angles fail, and all the while time helps the fugitive more than it helps the dead. As weeks stretch into months and months into years, a killer who has not been caught begins to shed the immediate outline of his former life. He learns how to answer to another name without hesitation. He adjusts his posture within the social world. He may relocate, find work, enter communities, even build new routines while the old identity calcifies into a poster or a file. The List case became infamous in part because this dead end lasted so long. John List did not just flee. He vanished into the ordinary fabric of American existence so thoroughly that the investigation risked becoming a ghost hunt conducted in filing cabinets, interview rooms, and memory. Meanwhile, the suspect pulled around the edges of the case would have continued generating noise. Financial motives always attract scrutiny. If there were debts, investigators would ask who was pressing hardest. If there were family tensions, they would ask who had spoken rashly, who stood to gain, who had been excluded, embarrassed, angered. If the family had been private, privacy itself could create distortions because people fill silence with projection. Some might speculate about conspiracies or hidden enemies. Others might try to explain the murders through a single dramatic conflict, preferring a sensational story to the bleak simplicity of paternal annihilation. But sensational alternatives often dissolve under evidence. Outsiders leave different traces. Their